I can heal your eyes, your majesty. The words drifted through the moonlit gardens of Shadowmere Estate like mist across ancient stone, soft and trembling, yet impossible to dismiss. Lysander Blackthorn turned his head toward the voice, though his silver eyes, clouded by centuries of darkness, could only grasp the endless void that had become his world. All around him, the Hamptons' night whispered with familiar sounds, the rustle of oak leaves, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs, the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the estate's sprawling grounds. His pale fingers tightened around the marble balustrade of the garden terrace. He knew these grounds intimately, not by sight, not anymore, but by scent, sound, and the weight of a mortal memory. It was where Seraphina brought him each evening after the sun had safely disappeared. His beloved fiancée said the night air cleared his mind, though lately she seemed more distant, more secretive. She would guide him to the same stone bench and then drift away, her silk gown whispering as she spoke in hushed tones to visitors who arrived under cover of darkness. Welcome back, my beautiful friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. Lysander never questioned these meetings. He was weary. The voice, young, human, female, came from behind the ancient rose bushes. But what startled him most was not the sound itself. It was the timing. She had waited. He hadn't sensed her before, but she must have been there, hidden perhaps among the shadows of the garden maze, perhaps behind the weathered gargoyle fountain. And only after Seraphina's footsteps had faded toward the estate's east wing did the girl approach, quiet, cautious, as if this moment were both precious and perilous. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of ages despite his uncertainty. "I said I can heal your eyes," she repeated, this time more clearly. No hesitation, no mockery, just unwavering certainty. A bitter smile touched Lysander's lips. "Child, you cannot imagine what has been attempted. Ancient rituals, blood magic from the oldest covens. Centuries of searching for a cure that doesn't exist. And now you believe a mortal girl can accomplish what vampire sorcery could not." "I don't believe," she said simply. "I know." He turned slightly, trying to sense her presence more clearly. She was close, perhaps sitting on the stone steps now. Small frame, steady heartbeat. He hadn't heard her approach, remarkable for a human in the presence of a vampire. "Why would you make such a claim?" She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "Because I heard her." "Heard who?" "The woman who cares for you," she said. "Lady Seraphina." His hands went still against the marble. "I work in the kitchens," the girl continued. "Sometimes I clean the halls late at night when the household sleeps. I've seen you both in these gardens for weeks. She always leaves you alone when her visitors arrive, so I listened. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I did." Her voice dropped lower. "She told them she did it. She said, 'The blind king's power flows into me with each passing moon,' and that she was nearly ready to claim what should have always been mine." Lysander's chest tightened. Something ancient and primal within him stirred, not his vampiric nature, but something deeper. The instinct of a ruler who had been betrayed. "I don't know exactly how she's doing it," the girl's voice trembled, "but I think she's stealing more than just your sight. She's taking your very essence." He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself wordless. "I didn't dare approach while she was near," the girl added. "She frightens me, but I had to wait until it was safe. I had to warn you." Lysander leaned back slowly. Through the night air, he caught the faint sound of Seraphina's laughter drifting from the estate's upper floors. "Lysander, darling, time to come inside," her melodious voice called across the gardens. The girl stood. He could hear the soft whisper of worn fabric against stone. "I'll return tomorrow night," she whispered. "Same time, when the moon is highest." She vanished as silently as she had appeared. Lysander didn't move. Not when Seraphina's familiar jasmine perfume grew stronger. Not when her cool hand touched his shoulder. His mind remained with a small voice that had seen through more than his blindness, and the impossible promise she carried like starlight in the darkness. For the first time in centuries, Lysander wondered, what if he hadn't lost everything? What if someone still truly saw him? The grandfather clock in Shadowmere's great hall chimed midnight as Lysander sat motionless in his study, fingers tracing the worn leather binding of a book he could no longer read. The ancient tome had once contained his favorite poetry, verses about moonlight and eternal love that now felt like mockery. Through the heavy oak doors, he could hear the soft murmur of voices drifting from the estate's east wing, Seraphina's voice among them, though she had told him she would be resting. This was the third night this week. Always the same pattern. She would settle him in his study with gentle kisses and whispered endearments, claiming exhaustion from managing the household affairs. Yet within the hour, he would hear the careful click of her heels against marble, followed by the creak of doors opening to admit visitors who arrived without announcement. Lysander's enhanced hearing caught fragments of conversation, words like transition and authority and when the time comes. But whenever he inquired about these late meetings, Seraphina would smile that musical laugh of hers and dismiss them as tedious coven politics, nothing that should concern him in his condition. His condition. The phrase had become her favorite, spoken with such tender concern that it took him months to notice the subtle satisfaction beneath it. Tonight felt different. The voices carried an urgency that made his ancient instincts stir. He rose from his chair, moving with the silent grace that centuries of vampiric existence had ingrained in him, and approached the door. The conversation grew clearer. The elder council grows impatient, a male voice was saying. They question why a blind king still holds dominion over the eastern territories. Patience, Marcus, Seraphina's voice replied, smooth as silk over steel. Everything proceeds according to plan. His dependency grows stronger each day. Soon even he will agree that stepping down is necessary. And if he refuses? He won't. There was something cold in her tone that Lysander had never heard before. The blood wine ensures his compliance. Each night, his will weakens while his power flows into me. By the next blood moon, the transformation will be complete. Lysander's hand tightened on the door frame. Blood wine. The nightly ritual Seraphina had introduced months ago, claiming it would help restore his strength. The goblet she brought him each evening with such loving care. The binding spell holds? Another voice asked. Perfectly. He suspects nothing. To him, I am still his devoted fiancée, sacrificing my own ambitions to care for her afflicted king. Seraphina's laugh was like breaking glass. He has no idea that his blindness was never a curse, it was a gift. My gift to him, and to our future. The voices began to fade as the group moved deeper into the estate. Lysander remained frozen, his world tilting on its axis. Not a curse. A gift. Her gift. Everything he had believed about his condition, about Seraphina's devotion, about his own helplessness, all of it had been carefully constructed lies. The woman he loved had stolen not just his sight, but his very essence, drop by drop, night after night. And tomorrow evening, when she brought him his wine with that same loving smile, he would have to pretend he knew nothing at all. The following evening, Lysander waited in the gardens with newfound purpose. Every shadow felt different now. Every sound carried new meaning. When Seraphina had brought him his nightly wine, he had accepted it with the same grateful smile he always wore, then discreetly poured it into the soil of a nearby planter when she turned away. The liquid had hissed against the earth like acid. Your Majesty? Evangeline's voice came softly from behind the rose bushes, cautious as always. I'm here, child. He turned toward her, and for the first time in centuries, wished desperately that he could see her face. Last night, after you left, I heard them talking. The midnight visitors? Yes. His voice carried the weight of his discovery. You were right about everything. The blood wine, the stolen power, all of it. He heard her sharp intake of breath, then the soft rustle of fabric as she moved closer. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I know how much you cared for her. Tell me about this healing you spoke of, he said, changing the subject before the pain could take root. What exactly do you believe you can do? Evangeline was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I've never told anyone about it. Not properly. People would think I was mad. Child, I am a 1,000-year-old vampire whose fiancé has been slowly draining his essence through enchanted wine. I am hardly in a position to judge what constitutes madness. A small laugh escaped her, nervous but genuine. When I was very young, maybe 6 or 7, I found an injured bird in the estate's gardens. Its wing was broken, twisted at an impossible angle. I held it in my hands and I could feel its pain like it was my own. But more than that, I could feel what was wrong, like seeing a map of all the places where light should be but wasn't. Lysander leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. I closed my eyes and imagined the light flowing back into those dark places. When I opened them again, the bird's wing was whole. It flew away as if nothing had happened. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I thought I had imagined it until it happened again. And again. Have you attempted this with humans? Other vampires? Small things. A cook's burned hand. A gardener's cut finger. But never anything like. She gestured toward his face, though he couldn't see it. Never anything this complex. This deliberate. Lysander considered her words. In his long existence, he had encountered many forms of magic, blood sorcery, elemental manipulation, necromancy. But healing magic, true healing magic, was among the rarest gifts. Most vampires considered it a myth. When you look at me, he asked carefully, what do you see? Chains, she said immediately. Silver chains wrapped around your eyes, but they're not really there. They're made of something else. Something that feels like stolen moonlight, if that makes sense. It made perfect sense. Moonlight had always been sacred to vampires, the source of their truest power. And you believe you can break these chains? I don't know, she admitted, but I have to try. 3 nights later, Evangeline arrived in the gardens with company. Lysander sensed the presence immediately, another vampire, ancient and powerful, moving with the careful grace of one accustomed to shadows. His instincts sharpened, muscles tensing despite his seated position. Your Majesty, Evangeline's voice carried a note of nervous excitement. I've brought someone who can help us. Someone who's been watching Lady Seraphina for longer than either of us realized. The stranger stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice held the refined accent of old European nobility. Your Majesty, I am Ethan Thornfield. I served your grandfather's court in the old country before the great migration to these shores. Lysander's breath caught. The Thornfield name was legendary among vampire aristocracy, a family of investigators and truth-seekers who had served the royal bloodlines for millennia. Ethan Thornfield died in the London fires of 1666. Reports of my death were strategically exaggerated. There was dry humor in the vampire's tone. It's remarkable how useful being officially dead can be for one's investigative work. Why are you here? Because 3 months ago, the European Council received disturbing reports about irregularities in the Eastern Territories. Power fluctuations. Unauthorized coven meetings. A blind king whose conditions seemed to be worsening rather than stabilizing. Ethan moved closer, his footsteps deliberate. They sent me to investigate. Evangeline's voice was barely a whisper. Show him what you found. The rustle of papers filled the night air. Financial records, Ethan explained. Lady Seraphina has been receiving substantial payments from the Blackwood Coven of Boston and the Ravenclaw Circle of Philadelphia. Both groups have been vocal about their desire to see the Eastern Territories restructured. Lysander's hands clenched. The Blackwood and Ravenclaw covens were old rivals, families who had contested his bloodline's right to rule for centuries. What kind of payments? The kind that buy loyalty and silence. But more concerning are these. More papers rustled. Shipping manifests for rare magical components. Moonstone dust from the Carpathian Mountains. Silver from the mines of Transylvania. Binding herbs that grow only in the shadow of ancient battlefields. The ingredients for a power transfer ritual, Lysander said grimly. Precisely. But not just any transfer, a permanent one. The kind that would leave the original host completely drained, possibly destroyed. Ethan's voice carried centuries of investigative authority. Your fiancée hasn't just been stealing your power, Your Majesty. She's been preparing to consume your very essence. Evangeline's sharp intake of breath cut through the night air. That's why the chains around his eyes feel so strong. She's not just blinding him, she's preparing to hollow him out completely. The ritual requires a blood moon, Ethan continued. The next one occurs in 6 days. If my calculations are correct, that's when she plans to complete the transfer and claim your throne permanently. Lysander sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of Seraphina's betrayal. Not just theft, but murder. Not just his power, but his very existence. There's more, Ethan said quietly. The European Council has already received word that you've been declared mentally unfit to rule. The announcement will be made public tomorrow night. The next evening, Lysander sat in his study with newfound awareness, every sense heightened as he waited for Seraphina's nightly visit. The familiar sound of her silk slippers against marble announced her approach, followed by the soft clink of crystal against silver, the wine service she brought him each night with such devoted care. My beloved, her voice was honey and starlight as she entered, carrying the scent of jasmine and something else, something metallic that he had never noticed before. I've brought your wine, the special vintage that helps with your condition. She placed the goblet in his hands with practiced gentleness, her cool fingers lingering against his, as they always did. But tonight, Lysander felt the subtle tremor in her touch, the barely perceptible eagerness as she waited for him to drink. You seem tired tonight, my dear, he said, lifting the goblet but not yet bringing it to his lips. These late council meetings must be exhausting. Nothing I cannot handle, she replied, settling into the chair beside him. The other covens require such careful management, especially with your situation. They worry about the stability of our territories. Lysander nodded sympathetically, tilting the goblet as if to drink while actually studying its contents with senses beyond sight. The wine's aroma was wrong. Beneath the rich notes of aged blood, he detected the sharp tang of crushed moonstone and the bitter undertone of binding herbs. The same ingredients Ethan had mentioned. Of course they worry, he said, pretending to sip while barely allowing the liquid to touch his lips. The small amount that did make contact burned like acid against his tongue. Perhaps it would be wise to consider their suggestions about transitional leadership. Seraphina's intake of breath was sharp, pleased. Oh, my love, I hoped you might come to see the wisdom in that. The burden of rule has been so heavy on you since your affliction began. Affliction. Not curse, not accident, affliction. As if it were a disease that had simply manifested, rather than something deliberately inflicted. I find myself growing weaker each night, he continued, setting the goblet down as if the effort of holding it had become too much. Perhaps it's time to accept that my reign should end. You're being so brave, she whispered, and he could hear the triumph she was trying to hide. I know how difficult this must be. But I promise you, beloved, I will ensure your legacy is preserved. The Eastern Territories will remain strong under our guidance. She leaned forward to kiss his forehead, and Lysander caught the full scent of the magic clinging to her, power that felt familiar because it was his own, absorbed and twisted through months of careful theft. "Drink your wine, my king," she murmured against his skin. "It will help you rest." After she left, Lysander sat motionless for a long time, the untouched goblet growing cold beside him. Then, with deliberate care, he carried it to the window and poured its contents into the garden below. Where the wine touched the earth, the grass withered and died, leaving a patch of blackened soil that would serve as a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. Tomorrow night he would need to be even more careful. The blood moon was only 5 days away. The fourth night brought restlessness that Lysander could no longer contain. After disposing of another goblet of poisoned wine, he found himself pacing his study like a caged predator, his vampiric nature rebelling against the passive role he had been forced to play. The blood moon was only 2 nights away, and sitting in darkness while Seraphina orchestrated his destruction felt like a betrayal of everything he had once been. He needed to leave the estate, to meet with Ethan and Evangeline somewhere beyond Seraphina's reach. The gardens had become too dangerous, too close to her midnight councils, too easily observed. But as he moved toward the study door, intending to navigate the familiar halls by memory and instinct, something stopped him cold. The air itself felt wrong. Thick, oppressive, charged with magic that made his skin crawl. He extended his senses, probing the darkness, and realized with growing horror that the entire estate was wrapped in surveillance spells. Invisible threads of power crisscrossed every corridor, every room, every possible exit. One step beyond his study, and Seraphina would know exactly where he was going. The magical web was intricate, layered, the work of months or perhaps years. She had been preparing for this moment far longer than he had imagined, turning his own home into an elaborate prison designed specifically for him. Lysander retreated to his chair, mind racing. If he couldn't leave undetected, he would have to find another way. The study's window faced the east gardens, a 20-foot drop to the terrace below. In his prime, such a leap would have been effortless. But months of magical poisoning had weakened him, and he couldn't be certain his vampiric abilities would sustain him. Still, he had to try. Moving with infinite care, he opened the window and felt the cool night air against his face. Below, he could hear the soft murmur of voices, Evangeline and Ethan, waiting in their usual spot by the fountain. They had come despite the danger, trusting that he would find a way to reach them. Lysander climbed onto the windowsill, balanced for a moment on the narrow ledge, then leaped. He landed hard, his weakened body betraying him at the last moment. Pain shot through his left ankle as he stumbled, catching himself against the fountain's edge with a sharp intake of breath. The sound echoed across the gardens like a gunshot. "Your Majesty!" Evangeline's voice was filled with alarm as she rushed to his side. "I'm fine," he whispered, though his ankle throbbed with each heartbeat. "But we need to move quickly. The estate is under surveillance, magical surveillance. She knows I'm here." Even as he spoke, he could feel the spells responding to his presence, invisible alarms triggering throughout Seraphina's network. Somewhere in the estate's depths, she would be receiving word that her prisoner had attempted escape. "Then we fight," Ethan said grimly, helping Lysander to his feet. "Tomorrow night, when she expects you to be weak and compliant, we show her exactly what a true vampire king is capable of." Lysander straightened, ignoring the pain in his ankle. The failed escape had revealed the extent of Seraphina's preparations, but it had also awakened something in him that months of captivity had nearly extinguished: his rage. The following evening, as Seraphina attended what she claimed was an emergency coven meeting, Ethan guided Lysander through the estate's forgotten passages to a secret chamber beneath the wine cellars. The air grew thick with ancient power as they descended, and Lysander recognized the scent of old magic, the kind that predated even his own considerable age. "She's been waiting for 3 hours," Ethan murmured as they approached a heavy oak door. "Elder Counselor Victoria Ashworth does not wait for anyone, Your Majesty." The fact that she came at all speaks to the gravity of our situation. Lysander straightened his shoulders, drawing upon centuries of royal bearing despite his weakened state. When the door opened, he felt the presence of true authority, power that made even his ancient bloodline seem young by comparison. Lysander Blackthorn. The voice was crisp, commanding, with the weight of millennia behind it. "You look terrible." "Elder Ashworth," he replied, inclining his head with the respect due to one of the original vampire lords. "I apologize for my appearance. Recent circumstances have been challenging. Sit before you fall over." There was no malice in her tone, only the practical concern of someone who had seen empires rise and fall. "Ethan has briefed me on your situation. The European Council is most displeased." Lysander settled into the chair Ethan provided, acutely aware of how his weakness must appear to someone of Victoria's stature. "What exactly has the Council been told?" "That you have become mentally unstable, paranoid, unable to distinguish reality from delusion." Victoria's footsteps circled him as she spoke, her assessment clinical and thorough. "Lady Seraphina has provided extensive documentation of your deteriorating condition. Medical reports, witness statements, recordings of conversations where you allegedly spoke to people who weren't there. All fabricated, I assume." "Masterfully so. She has been building this case for over a year, Lysander. Every stumble, every moment of confusion caused by her poisoning, carefully documented as evidence of your unfitness to rule." Victoria paused directly in front of him. "Tomorrow night, during the Blood Moon ceremony, she intends to present a formal petition to dissolve your sovereignty. The Council has already been primed to accept it." Lysander's hands clenched. "And my response? My defense?" "You won't be permitted one. According to the documentation, you are too unstable to represent yourself. Lady Seraphina has been appointed as your legal guardian, with full authority to speak on your behalf." Victoria's voice carried centuries of disgust. "She will, of course, reluctantly accept the burden of leadership to prevent chaos in the Eastern Territories. The other covens, the Blackwoods, the Ravenclaws, they support this? They have been promised significant territorial concessions in exchange for their backing. Your fiancée has been quite thorough in securing her political position." Ethan stepped forward. "There is one option, Your Majesty. The right of challenge. Ancient law that supersedes all modern political maneuvering." Victoria's approval was audible in her voice. "Precisely. If you can prove your fitness to rule through trial by combat or demonstration of power, no council vote can override your sovereignty. But I am blind, weakened." "Then you had better find a way to change that," Victoria said sharply. "Because tomorrow night, you either reclaim your throne or lose everything forever." The great hall erupted in chaos as the crystal sphere's revelations echoed through the assembled vampires. Accusations flew between the covens, alliances crumbled in real time, and the carefully orchestrated political theater Seraphina had constructed collapsed around her like a house of cards. Silence. Lysander's voice cut through the tumult with the authority of a true king. The room fell quiet, every vampire present recognizing the power that had returned to him. "Lady Seraphina, you stand accused of treason, magical assault, and conspiracy against the crown. How do you answer?" Seraphina's composure had shattered completely, her beautiful features twisted with desperation and rage. But as the weight of her exposure settled upon her, something calculating flickered in her eyes. She straightened, smoothing her silk gown, and when she spoke, her voice carried the honeyed persuasion that had once captivated him. "My beloved Lysander," she said, stepping closer to the throne with practiced grace. "Surely we can discuss this privately. What happened between us, it was born of love, of concern for your well-being and the stability of our territories." The assembled vampires watched in fascination as she continued her desperate gambit. "I admit my methods were unconventional, But everything I did was to protect you, to protect us. The other covens were growing restless, questioning your ability to lead. I simply provided a solution that would benefit everyone. She reached the base of the dais, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she had used during their most private moments. We could rule together as we always planned. Share the power, share the throne. The council need never know the full extent of what transpired. We could present it as a temporary regency that evolved naturally into joint leadership. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Several vampires nodded thoughtfully. The offer had political merit, a way to resolve the crisis without the messy complications of a formal trial and execution. Lysander studied her face, seeing clearly for the first time in months the cold ambition that had always lurked beneath her mask of devotion. You would have me pretend that months of poisoning, theft, and betrayal were simply political maneuvering? I would have you be practical, she replied, her voice gaining strength. Punishing me serves no one. But together, we could build something greater than either of us could achieve alone. The hall held its breath, waiting for his response. Even Elder Counselor Victoria watched with interest, her ancient eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. Lysander rose from his throne, his restored sight taking in every face in the room, the hopeful expressions of those who favored compromise, the calculating looks of political opportunists, the disappointed faces of those who had expected justice. No, he said simply. I will not build my renewed reign on a foundation of lies and shared guilt. The vampire courts will know the truth of what happened here, and they will know that treachery against the crown carries consequences. He turned to Victoria. Elder Counselor, I formally request that Lady Seraphina be tried before the full European Council for her crimes. Seraphina's face went white as her last hope crumbled. You fool, she whispered. You could have had everything. I already do, Lysander replied. I have my sight, my throne, and my honor intact. 3 months after Seraphina's trial and exile, Lysander stood in the renovated east wing of Shadowmere Estate, watching as Evangeline directed the placement of healing crystals throughout what would become the first treatment room of their new sanctuary. Sunlight, something he had never thought to appreciate again, streamed through tall windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floors. The wards are holding perfectly, Ethan reported, entering with a stack of applications from supernatural beings seeking refuge. Word has spread faster than we anticipated. We have requests from werewolf packs whose alphas have been challenged by power-hungry rivals, fae whose courts have been infiltrated by dark magic users, even a few young vampires whose sires have abandoned them. Lysander nodded, his restored sight allowing him to read the genuine hope in each carefully written plea. The Eternal Sanctuary had begun as a simple idea, a place where vulnerable supernatural beings could find protection and healing, but it had quickly evolved into something far more significant. Elder Counselor Ashworth sent word this morning, Evangeline said, approaching with a crystal that pulsed with gentle silver light. The European Council has officially endorsed our work. They're providing funding and legal protection for our residents. The transformation in Evangeline herself was remarkable. No longer the frightened maid who had whispered warnings in moonlit gardens, she had blossomed into a confident healer whose reputation was already spreading throughout supernatural society. Her gift for breaking magical bindings had proven invaluable. She had already freed a dozen victims of various forms of mystical exploitation. There's something else, Ethan continued, his expression growing serious. We've received intelligence about a trafficking ring operating out of Boston. Young supernatural beings are being captured and sold to collectors who want exotic pets. The victims are being kept compliant through magical restraints similar to what Seraphina used on you. Lysander's jaw tightened. His own experience with magical imprisonment had given him a visceral understanding of such violations. How many? At least 20 that we know of. Possibly more. Then we go to Boston, Lysander said without hesitation. The sanctuary's mission isn't just to provide refuge, it's to actively combat this kind of exploitation. Evangeline placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm with healing magic. Are you certain you're ready for something like this? It's only been 3 months since I learned that power without purpose is meaningless. Lysander smiled, covering her hand with his own. Evangeline, for centuries I ruled from a throne, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. But I never truly understood what it meant to protect the vulnerable until I became vulnerable myself. He looked around the sanctuary's main hall, where several residents were already making themselves at home: a young werewolf whose pack had rejected her, a fey child whose wings had been clipped by cruel relatives, an elderly vampire whose progeny had tried to drain his accumulated power. "This is what kingship should be," he said quietly. "Not commanding from above, but standing beside those who need protection." As the sun set over the Hamptons, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lysander felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: true purpose. The crown of shadows had been replaced by something far more valuable: the light of genuine service.